This is the SF&SF podcast for August 2018. This is a special edition featuring George R.R. Martin. It was recorded live at the Fox Theater in Redwood City, and it's a fundraiser for Locus Magazine. And now the coordinator of SF&SF, Rena Weissman.
Good evening, everyone. Welcome to an evening with George R.R. Martin and John Picacio. My name is Rena Weissman. I'm the coordinator of SF&SF programs. We do science fiction in San Francisco. Since 2004, we've presented fantasy and science fiction, horror, and genre authors and films at both the American Bookbinders Museum and the Balboa Theater in San Francisco. You can find us online at sfinsf.org, but tonight we're more than delighted to be here at the historic Fox Theater in Redwood City. As you may have already discovered, because I've seen some of you carrying literally a foot of books, Borderlands Books has some great titles for sale up on the mezzanine. The recipient of tonight's effort, Locus Magazine and the Locus Science Fiction Foundation, has some great premiums for new subscribers. You can do print, you can do digital, but it is an essential part of any science fiction or fantasy fan's repertoire, believe me. And the 76th Annual World Science Fiction Convention, and Diane Osborne will be happy to sign you up for the weekend's festivities, so make sure you visit them all at the intermission or after the event. And just a note, afterwards we'll be hosting a Q&A with audience members, so please feel free when we reconvene after our break to use the mic to the side at stage left, and Marin of Soma FM Internet Radio will be there to assist you. And as a little extra please note, we will have a little thank you gift for attendees in the lobby as you exit, so take a look for that. So your being here tonight is especially important. This event is a fundraiser for the Locus Science Fiction Foundation, the nonprofit arm of Locus Magazine. They're celebrating their 50th anniversary this year. Yay! Any magazine that lasts 50 years is worth celebrating, believe me. They are the magazine of record for the science fiction fantasy literary field. And as a board member of the foundation, thank you all for contributing to their continued existence by being here tonight. Locus Magazine was founded in 1968 in New York by Charles N. Brown and others. It began as a one-page mimeographed zine made to promote the Boston in 71 Worldcon bid. You'll remember what mimeographs were, right? Yes. That's probably a Locus staffer up there who ran the mimeograph machine. At one point soon, Charles Brown relocated to Oakland. He actually quit his day job in 1976 to run the magazine as a full-time editor. In the late 1970s, Locus became a monthly, and it's firmly established as the preeminent trade magazine for the science fiction fantasy publishing field. They feature book reviews, author interviews, coverage of forthcoming books, all the science fiction and fantasy conventions that you could wish for, and listings of all science fiction and fantasy books published in English. And over the years, they have won an incredible 30 Hugo Awards for their work. Since January 2011, as well, the magazine is published in both print and digital, so you can really have it all. Upon the death of Charles Brown in 2009, executive editor Liza Groen-Tromby took the helm very capably as the editor-in-chief and publisher and launched the nonprofit Locus Science Fiction Foundation. So this event, to benefit the foundation, is made possible by the help given by many. I'd like to first and foremost thank Tachyon Publications, a local science fiction fantasy publisher, who is our generous sponsor underwriting the evening. Thank you. I would also like to thank Rhea Golden, Lenore Gallegos, the amazing and tremendous Borderlands Books, the World Science Fiction Convention, Christine Doyle, Kevin Roche, Soma FM Internet Radio, who is recording this event for later podcast, the Fox Theater and their fabulous staff, Broadway by the Bay for allowing us to co-opt this beautiful theater for the evening from their Saturday Night Fever production. And last but not least, a great, great thank you and an incredible debt that I could never repay, and anybody who is a fan of the magazine can't except by subscribing. The incredible staff, interns, and volunteers that have kept Locus in print for the past 50 years. Thank you. Our guests this evening, they're both friends and professional collaborators. They're well known to the science fiction and fantasy world. Artist John Picacio is one of the most acclaimed American artists in the science fiction and fantasy field over the last decade. He created the best-selling artwork for George R.R. Martin's A Song of Ice and Fire series, including the 2012 calendar, as well as the Star Trek and X-Men franchises. Major clients in book production, design, and cover art include Penguin, Random House, Tor Books, HarperCollins, Scholastic, Simon & Schuster, Tachyon Publications, Subterranean Press, Baen Books, Dark Horse Comics, among others. His body of work features major cover illustrations for authors such as Michael Moorcock, Lauren Bucas, Harlan Ellison, James Dashner, Frederick Pohl, Dan Simmons, Sherry Tepper, James Tiptree Jr., Chris Roberson, Jeffrey Ford, Joe R. Lansdale, and many, many more. I'm sure you recognize some of your favorite authors in that list. So, our other guest really doesn't need any introduction, except I will say, yes, he knows. Don't ask. And with that, I would like to introduce John Picacio and George R.R. Martin. Thank you.
How are you beautiful people out there? Thanks for coming out. This is going to be fun. Wow, there's a lot of you up there.
This is a cool place.
Yeah, it's beautiful.
Look at this theater. Very nice.
Yeah.
I love old theaters.
You going to take this one over too?
I've met the owner.
Lori might have something to say about that.
Like that, yeah.
No, this is gorgeous. All right.
Well, thank you all for coming.
Yeah.
To our little presentation here.
Yeah.
On behalf of Locus Magazine.
Yay, Locus!
Now, you're helping to support Locus just by being here and paying your admission, but those of you who are interested in science fiction and fantasy, if you're not already a subscriber to Locus, you should get yourself a subscription. It's the Publisher's Weekly of science fiction. It's part of the field. It reviews all the current books, has all the current news, great interviews. So, yay, Locus.
Yeah, for sure. And thank you to Rena and SF for putting this together. I mean, she's been grinding for weeks to make this happen. So, yeah, I must say, let's give a hand to Rena Weissman and SF. So, you know, she gives this long intro for me, and of course for him, we don't need anything, right? And I think that's pretty valid, you know? So half you guys in this room are like, who the hell is this guy? We were sitting back there chatting it up as we do, and I didn't even realize, here it is, we've known about this for months now, and I realized, wait a minute, 10 years ago is when he and I kind of had he thinks he remembers us meeting earlier than this, but 10 years ago is when I walk up to him at a Worldcon. It's the 2008 World Science Fiction Convention in Denver, Colorado. And it was a Saturday night. It was a party. There were parties going on in the party hotel as they do. And I walk up to him. He's with a group of his friends. And I was walking in there, I think, with Lou Anders and a few of my friends. And I had a portfolio back in those days surgically attached to my armpit. And because I was always hustling for gigs, and I walked up to him and I said, hey man, I don't want to show you any pictures right now, but sometime during the show I'd love to show you a few, and you know, I do covers. He's like, don't worry John, I already know who you are. I was like, how the hell do you know who I am? And he's like, you did this cover, you did Elric, you've done this, you've done this, you've done that. And he just rattled them off the top of his head while he's drinking, he's got a Coke in his hand or whatever he was drinking. And I was like, holy shit, you do know who I am. And you know, he said, don't worry, we'll work together someday. And I remember walking away with Lou and my friends saying, he was just being nice. He was just buttering me up. But that was a really great brush off. That was amazing how he did that. That was incredible. And I really did think he just was the coolest guy, and it was amazing how he just brushed me off like that. It was super awesome. And then a year later, I'm at World Science Fiction Convention again. And I mean, give a show of hands here, or give some applause if you know what WorldCon and World Science Fiction Convention is, please. Okay, so that's not the entire house. So some of you actually don't know that World Science Fiction Convention is about to happen this week here in your town. So please be aware, by the end of this, you ought to look into that. It's an amazing, magical experience. So just to finish the story off real quick, I was at Montreal next year in 2009 for WorldCon, and he walks up to me this time at a party and says, hey, remember that last time we talked last year? Let's go talk in the bar. And we did. Do you want to tell your version of this, or should I just keep going?
Well, you're doing fine. You can continue. Yes,
okay.
That was where I asked you about the calendar.
Yeah. So he says, so we go down to this bar, and we pick the back table, and he says, have you read my Song of Ice and Fire books? And I said, are those the big fat ones? He said, yeah, those are the big fat ones. And I was like, yeah, I haven't read them. And he says, yeah. He says, yeah, I guessed. And I said, you know, at the time, I remember, I'll just shorten this up, but basically I said, I'm working on 13 covers right now, and I'm working on all the interiors for the new Michael Moorcock Elric omnibus, and you know, I've got a lot of stuff going on. And he says, I've got this calendar project I'm wanting to do with my Song of Ice and Fire books. And have you seen the Michael Comarch calendar? Michael Comarch's an amazing illustrator. I said, yeah, I've seen it, but I haven't seen it in stores. And he's like, yeah, that's because it has horrible distribution. He says, we're taking it to Random House, and I want to revamp this project. Because you said you wanted calendars sort of in the tradition of what the Hildebrandt brothers.
Well, what the Tolkien calendar, the annual Tolkien calendar, which had been going for many, many years. I wanted to do something similar for Westeros and, you know, Song of Ice and Fire. And, yeah, we did launch it in 2009. Michael Comarch did the first one. Yeah. But for a small publisher, and there were real problems with order fulfillment and distribution. In 2010, we were supposed to do one. Mike Kaluta was signed to do it, but then it fell apart over payment issues and all that. So we had to revamp it all with 2011. So I think that was the one I asked, do you want to be...
I was supposed to do that one, but remember I was too slow. I was taking too long, so we put in the Naismith...
that's right, yes, that's right, yes.
But that worked out really well for me, because Naismith ended up... His calendar came out right before season 1 of Game of Thrones happens. But I'm missing a beat here, y'all. I want to tell you this. So I tell him at the time that I have no business doing this calendar. I'm sitting there in that bar in Montreal saying, I've got no business doing this because I've got too much work going on. But I said, I can't say no to this either because I've always wanted to work with you. So yeah, I'd love to do this. And we shook hands. And that is still one of the most magical experiences of my life, that handshake.
Well, actually, first I said, well, I want you to do the calendar, and you said, what month?
Which month?
Which month?
I was a total dumbass, y'all. I said, which month? I'm serious. I did.
Said, well, all of them.
Yeah, I was a complete dumbass. But yeah, 2 weeks later, I signed the deal with Random House, and then he calls me up and says, hey, I signed a deal today too. Or I just signed a deal as well, and it was HBO to do Game of Thrones. But I will say this, man, from the beginning, even at that bar in the basement in Montreal, in the basement of that hotel in Montreal, he said, I want a John Picasso vision of my book characters. He says, there may be something coming down the road here. And I think even at the bar, I don't know if you used the words HBO, but you knew something was coming, obviously. But you said, don't pay attention to any of that. And that's what really made that project such a dream project. Because at this point, my point is, there was no Game of Thrones TV show. This was just me doing my interpretation of these characters. And it was one of the best pieces of art direction I've ever been given, which was just basically trust the artist. And he put his total faith in me, and I've always been grateful for that.
Very, very happy with the Ice and Fire calendar. I mean, it's not a big money maker. You know,
it was that year.
Well, sadly, a lot of people don't buy calendars anymore. Calendar sales have been like that. Everybody knows what day it is on their phone. So calendar sales are not what they were. But I love, as we'll talk about later, I love science fiction and fantasy art. And we have had chances not only to have John and Ted Naismith before him and Michael Comark, but since then we've had Gary Gianni, we had Magali Villeneuve,
Donato Giancola.
Yeah, and Donato. This year's calendar that just came out is by John Jude Palancar.
Yep.
And we have
Eric Velhagen?
Yeah, Eric Velhagen did one, and Didier Graffet, the French artist.
He's awesome.
So Michael Simonetti.
So we basically
we've had some of the yeah. I mean, what I wanted it to be would be the leading fantasy and science fiction artists around the world. Get each one to do their own visions. And of course, when the show came out, the HBO also came out with their calendar. So you can, if you want, you can buy a calendar that's stills from the show and pictures of the actors. But when we hire artists to do that, most of them have seen the show now. But I said we don't paint the actors. We can't do that. HBO has theirs with pictures of the actors, and we have ours, which are your interpretations of my words on paper.
Yeah, but that was the cool thing too. Is like he had told me that he wanted this vision of his book characters and that there might be this TV show. And I remember that phone call too, where you said, "If we could just get a pilot done, I'd be happy." Remember that? At that point, you were just hoping that we could get a pilot done.
We actually got 2 pilots done, but that's another story.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, this was a different era, and and yet it wasn't that long ago, and so at that point there was no Peter Dinklage's Tyrion or I'm blanking on the actors, but there you go. I'm an
many
artist,
of them.
Right?
Maisie Williams, Amelia Clark,
yeah.
Kit Harington.
So yeah, I didn't have these actors in my head, and I look back now and thank God I didn't have them in my head, because I don't have to block them out,
Right.
But anyway, so that project happened, and it was 10 years ago this month. So I'm gonna get this out of the way, because I'm already can tell just looking around the room. There's a question that's just hanging right in there. So we're
My favorite color is purple. I knew you wanted to know.
There you go, Psychic Hotline. Where are you at with Winds of Winter? How's it coming?
Working on it. Working on it. Believe me, you'll know when it's done. It'll be the shout that is heard round the world.
So we got Fire and Blood coming in November.
November, that's right. Fire and Blood, Volume 1.
Volume 1. So this book, yeah, go ahead. Give it up.
And I know that a day after Fire and Blood #1 hits the stands and is sold, someone will say, when is Fire and Blood #2 coming out? So
it's true.
the answer will be years from now.
When did it first occur to you that the Targaryen? So this book is basically a massive history of the Targaryens. And when did it first occur to you that this needed to be put into a published volume on its own like this? How far back were you thinking?
The history is kind of checkered. A number of years ago we did the World of Ice and Fire. Have any of you seen that? The concordance book. And the idea of that book was to do a concordance of Westeros and the world beyond Westeros, and to do it as a art book. We wanted beautiful art in a coffee table book, large, oversized book, with lots of art displayed beautifully, high gloss paper, so the artwork would be showed to best advantage. Art on every page, and I brought in 2 Uber fans, Elio Garcia and Linda Antonsen, who do the Westeros website, to help me with this, because of course I was writing the books and working on the show, and the idea was, okay, Elio and Linda would go through all of the published novels and pull out every reference I've had to history, to other kingdoms, to past Targaryen kings. They would organize everything I'd already said, the canon, and then I would look at that, and they would write a rough draft of the history based on what the stuff I'd already said. I would look at it, I would polish it, and I would flesh out places where there were holes, where I hadn't said very much. And then I said, there are certain aspects of history that I know a certain amount about that I've never actually put in the books. It exists, it's in my head, it's in my notes, but it's not in the book. So I'll write a few sidebars that'll be, little interesting stories that never have gotten in the books yet. And we budgeted this. We did a contract. We had a big art budget to buy a lot of art for this art on every page concept. And the contract called for 50,000 words of prose. So Ilya and Linda got in there and they pulled out my stuff and they organized it all and they put it chronologically and they indicated there were holes and they submitted it to me and they had 70,000 words. So we were 20,000 words over before I even started. And then I took what they did and I polished it, expanded it and filled up in the holes and now we're up to like 100,000 words. And then I started writing my sidebars, and I got halfway through the Targaryens, and I realized I'd written 350,000 words of sidebars. So my publisher said, well, we could do this, but this idea of art on every page will, we've already spent the entire art budget to illustrate the 50,000 words you were supposed to write, and we don't have any more art budget here. And artists, I don't know if you guys know this, but these artists have this annoying habit of wanting to be paid. That somehow the honor of working on a project like this is just not enough for them.
No.
They want to be paid. So if we publish all this, it's going to have to be art on every 20 pages and then 20 pages of text. Well, no, that's not the concept. So I ripped out all of my sidebars. And we went ahead and we finished the book and we published it. It's a very nice book. It has art on every page. It's gorgeous. It has the histories. Elio and Linda condensed a lot of the stuff that I'd done. They abridged it very severely. They cut it back. But meanwhile, I was left with 350,000 words of Targaryen history. And I started taking versions of it, and my friend Gardner Dozois, who passed away a few months ago, had these anthologies, so and some of them I did with him. So we published a chunk of it in Dangerous Women, which Gardner and I did together, The Princess and the Queen, and we published another chunk called The Rogue Prince, an anthology called Rogues, and just earlier, or late last year, we published a section called Sons of the Dragon in Gardner's anthology, Book of Swords. But there was a lot more, and so I said, well, this will be my Silmarillion. We called it the Grimmarillion. And I will get back to it when I finish the main series, and then I will publish this Silmarillion, Grimmarillion, whatever. And that was the way it was for several years while I worked on the books. But then, as you know, HBO decided to develop a number of successor series to Game of Thrones. Because Game of Thrones is ending, as you may know. This upcoming 8th season will be the last. But it won't be the last thing of Westeros. We're developing 5 successor series, and there may be more. And some of those successor series are based on material from my sidebars. So when my publishers heard that, they said, well, we should publish the sidebars then before the new shows come out. So can you finish up, I'd left a few holes in this. Can you finish that part up and then we'll publish that? And we want that next. So I filled up the holes and we finished the first volume, Fire and Blood, and November 20th it'll be out. It covers all of Targaryen history from Aegon's conquest up to the regency for Aegon III, which is about half of Targaryen history. There's a lot more left. And there's a lot of, there's versions of The Princess and the Queen and The Rogue Prince. The versions that you read in those anthologies, if you read them, are abridged. These will be the full versions for the first time published. And then there's a lot of material about kings that has never been published before. So that's all in there too. And it should be we're going to have some art in it. It's not going to be a coffee table book though, but we will have some lovely interior art, more like the variety of if any of you have seen the Night of the Seven Kingdoms with the black and white art and that's all by Gary Johnny, or more recently the anniversary edition of Game of Thrones had a variety of artists illustrating it, so it'll be more like that with black and white illustrations and all that.
Doug Wheatley, right? Doug Wheatley
Yes.
doing the art on this one?
Yes.
Yeah, like 75, it's still going to be like 75 illustrations.
Yes, yes. And there'll be a deluxe edition from Subterranean Press that'll have that plus more, even more art. Cool. I do like fantasy art, as you see. I try to sneak it into the books whenever I can.
Yay. We'll come back to that bit at the end. I'm actually going to bounce us back a little more toward early roots here. Preparing for this event, I think I've watched just about every interview you've done since 2011 on YouTube, which is like 30 hours of stuff.
Oh dear.
You've gone over this a bit before in those, but I want to take this in a slightly different direction. So you're growing up in Bayonne, New Jersey. You grew up as a poor kid, but your family wasn't always poor, and you had a certain set of memories and experiences growing up within the area that you did, where you had to encounter the mistakes of your
my family during my lifetime was poor. But yes, we had family legends, family histories of what had come before us. Yeah. My mother was a Brady, and the Bradys came to the United States during the potato famine and settled in Bayonne and made quite a success of themselves. There was a Brady's Tavern that was very popular in the 1800s, and one of the big social centers of Bayonne. They got very active in democratic politics. Some of them were elected. And there's a couple generations back, they started a construction company, construction materials, that was very successful. Even had so much stuff delivered that they built a dock for shipments of gravel and cement and other things needed for construction. It became known as Brady's Dock. Unfortunately, there was this thing called the Great Depression, and they managed to lose all of their money then. And the company went bust and was acquired, and the dock was lost, and everything was lost here. So by the time I came along, none of the money was left. The house that my mother had been born in, which was on between 3rd and 4th Street on Lourdes Avenue in Bayonne, had been sold, and other people live there now. And we wound up moving into an apartment, a federal housing low-income project on 1st Street. Oddly enough, right across from City Dock, which was formerly Brady's Dock. And then I would walk to school on 5th Street, and I would walk past the house that my family had owned but no longer owned. And it was like, okay, I'm poor, but I came from this, nobility. I was Daenerys Targaryen. Always hearing these stories of... oh yeah, that dock across the street, that used to be your grandfather's, but now it belongs to the city. Oh, that house, yeah, other people living there. But that was where my mother was born, and, all of my uncles and aunts were born in that house and grew up in that. So, yeah, but now we're nothing, but we will be back. So that was always the stuff. So I had this sense of being, on one hand, very poor, and being a project kid, which was sort of stigmatized and looked down upon. We were the poor kids. Everybody surrounding lived in single-family homes. But also I came from, lost royalty and riches.
Yeah, but that...
An interesting juxtaposition.
Yeah, that juxtaposition, did that sort of define... Do you feel like that defines sort of your work ethic and the way you handle your work as a writer? Talk about that a little bit.
I think it helped shape my personality. I don't know if it influenced me as a writer. Seeing people who live in a poor environment, like a project, a low-income project where you have to prove how poor you are even to get in there. And if you make too much money, they kick you out, which is ultimately what happened to my family. My father got a job as a longshoreman, and as he got more and more seniority. He worked more and more often, and that's a union job. It's pretty well paid, and ultimately they said, hey, you guys are making too much money. Get out. But I always kind of had the belief that we should get out. I think a lot of people who are in a poor environment, there's a message that is put into them either consciously or subconsciously. Somehow you absorb that by osmosis, that you belong there. You're not as good as other people. You know, you're having to live in this, you know, low-income area with other low-income people because you're not worthy of any more than this. But in my case, I never had that feeling that can get drummed into you because I always had this countervailing thing. Yeah. Hey, we used to own that fucking dock. My grandfather owned that dock, so, you know, don't, you know. Right. And I think that helps you. I mean, one of the things that kids coming from any environment need is a sense of possibility, a sense of hope. Even if you're living poor now, you know that you can change that the fortune that can bring you down can also lift you up. You have to have that belief in yourself, that belief in the possibilities, that sense of hope. And, you know, I did have that. Yeah.
I mean, we've talked a number of times, you and I, about the ups and downs of being a creator, and, you know, that it's a lot of times about how you pick yourself up. And you told me once, we were at you donated the 5 millionth book to the Texas A&M's Cushing Library a couple years ago, I guess. Right. It was the first edition of The Hobbit, and we were there for that ceremony, and there was an offhand comment you made there where you said, you know, you had crashed and burned your career at least twice, and I thought maybe it would be really cool to hear you talk about. I know one of them is the Armageddon rag, but I don't know what the other one is. And
it was Hollywood, my first go-around in Hollywood.
Yeah.
You know, I teach at Clarion West workshops, Odyssey, Taos Toolbox. I've done that. I deal with young writers. Are any of you here an aspiring writer? Raise your hands if you want to write.
Raise them high, for God's sake. There you go. Now
okay,
I see.
There's a number of you.
Yeah,
here.
There's a lot of you, actually.
So the thing that I tell the young writers at these workshops is that if you value security, this is not a job for you. Accounting, I hear, is very good. Certainly this computer thing, I think those are here to stay, these computer things. And if you learn how to be good with that, that's probably a nice, you know, future there. And we're here in Silicon Valley, so that might work out for you guys. But writing fiction, telling stories, it could be a very fulfilling and exciting thing, but you're never going to have any security. It's not something where you can start and work your way up and then, you know, get a raise and get another raise a few years later, and at the end of your career they give you a gold watch and a nice pension package. No, that's not in the cards for you. You have to be a bit of a gambler to enter any creative profession, whether it's acting, and I know a lot of aspiring actors, whether it's art, whether it's writing stories or screenplays, because the market is volatile. It goes up and down. You can be very hot, you can be very cold, and it can go from one to another like that. I mean, I broke in the 70s. I was a hot young writer for like a decade, and I was winning awards, being nominated for awards. Publishers, four publishers bid on my first novel in an auction. It was all very exciting. And then I got more money even for my second novel, and I got more money for my third novel. And sooner or later, it was just a matter of time till I hit that bestseller list. And boy, I thought this was like the easiest profession in the world. And then my fourth novel, The Armageddon Rag, came out, and nobody bought it. And suddenly, I couldn't get people to return my phone calls, and I couldn't sell my fifth novel, and I was taking a course in how to buy and sell real estate with no money down. You know, I sent away for these tapes from late night TV because I didn't know how the hell I was going to pay my mortgage.
Why do you think it tanked? Well, looking back now, I mean, what do you think?
Well,
what do you see now that you didn't see then?
The Armageddon Rag was an unusual novel. It was a rock and roll fantasy horror novel about the children of the 60s in the 80s, and it was, you know, sold for a lot of money. My my publisher at the time thought it would be the big breakout bestseller book for me. But no, I mean, oddly enough, at the time I sold it, people say, well, rock and roll novels don't sell. But this one, my editor was so convinced, well, this one will be the exception. We'll prove the falsehood of that rule. Well, no, they just proved the truth of that rule. I mean, a lot of people love rock and roll, but if you love rock and roll, you don't want to read about fake made-up bands like my band in the book. You want to read about the Rolling Stones or the Beatles or the Eagles or whoever your favorite band is. So I think that was part of it. I was doing a lot of cross-genre work, and you know, when you're not writing, if you're writing a space opera, it's a space opera, an epic fantasy. But when you're mixing things together and saying, well, this is partly a mystery novel, but it's not really a mystery novel. It's also got fantasy elements in it, and it's really a novel about the 60s, you know, then you're taking a risk here. But the point is, my career as a novelist was effectively over. And thankfully, I got involved in television at the same time. And then over the next 10 years, I repeated the same career path of being, you know, starting out at the bottom as a staff writer on Twilight Zone, writing a couple scripts for them, getting promoted to story editor, getting promoted to co-producer, going to Max Headroom, going to Beauty and the Beast, climbing the things, and finally, you know, up to the thing where I could be a showrunner. I was getting what they call overall deals, where they just pay you a salary to come up with new concepts for them, come up with pilots and all that stuff. And I came up with a bunch of pilots. I wrote a bunch of pilots. I wrote a bunch of feature films. None of them got made. I mean, people loved them, but for one reason or another, and every one is a thing, none of them got made. And at one point, they looked around and said, ooh, we've been paying this guy a lot of money to come up with ideas, but nobody is buying his shows, so let's not renew his deal. And suddenly it was the same thing. Wow. I was back, you know, now I had burned out television the same way I had earlier burned out book publishing. And I couldn't get my agent, my Hollywood agent, to return my call. Thankfully, my book agents have always been very great and loyal. But Hollywood is a fickler kind of thing. So at that point, I had learned one thing from the Armageddon Rag experience from the first time my career crashed and burned. So I give this advice to all the young writers out there if you're ever going to follow it. Don't take on debt. Don't take on debt.
Too late.
I mean, when Armageddon Red failed, I was faced with losing my house because I had I had bought a house that was nicer than, you know, predicated on the thing that I would be able to maintain my career at a certain level, and now my career was not at that level. In fact, it was at no level. I couldn't get fucking arrested. So how was I going to make my mortgage payments? And, you know, I bought a nice car. How was I going to make my car payments? You know, suddenly I had no income and I had big debts and I was living on my credit card. And then, of course, oh, very bad. Don't do that. Don't ever do that. In the 10 years in Hollywood, I came to my senses. I paid off my mortgage. I paid off my car. I paid off all of my credit card debts. And so then the second time my career crashed and burned, well, I didn't have a whole lot of money coming in, but I didn't have to worry about losing my house because my house was free and clear. My car was free and clear. Everything was free and clear. I've never gotten myself in any significant amount of debt since. And so, you know, not having a lot of money, but then again, not having a lot of obligation, I sat down and started writing this book called Game of Thrones, and that worked out pretty well. So... But, you know, it is a crapshoot. If you want to write, it can be one of the most satisfying professions you ever have. You're telling stories. You're living in your own world. You put it out there, and if you find an audience and people love it, that's so gratifying. But, you know, you don't have a boss. You don't have. You could sleep late in the morning if you want to. Occasionally people will ask you for your autograph or something like that, or you'll get to do something cool like this. There are a lot of rewards to doing that, but the work itself is the greatest reward. I love telling my stories, creating my characters, creating my worlds. I couldn't think of anything I'd rather do in the world than that profession. And the fact that it is occasionally lucrative and enables me to, you know, to buy houses and cars and pay my mortgage so I don't have to be a homeless person pushing a shopping cart, is good. But I sometimes think I would do it even if I was a homeless person pushing a shopping cart. I'd be stopping you in the street with my shopping cart saying, "Would you like to read my new story?" I'll read it to you.
You know, there are a lot of books out there about writer's block and how you deal with that, and how you deal with, if you're a visual artist, how you deal with a blank canvas. And something I've thought about as, when I go back to that meeting we first had, and then me signing the contract for that calendar and him signing the deal with HBO, when we had that talk on the phone, I remember asking him, I think you even told me, you didn't tell me the exact amount of money. I don't think we went that far, but you said it was a lot. And I said, for that amount of money, I know this won't happen, but just speculating. Could they actually write the story ahead of you? If they caught up to you, could they, conceivably tell the story without you? And you kind of paused for a second. You said, yeah, they could do that. And I said, but that won't happen. And he's like, no, it won't happen. I don't think so either. But he said it could. But I remember you saying, if it did, they could conceivably do that. And that was back then. You knew that could happen, but I don't think you saw that at that point. But now it has happened. And so now that it's happened, sometimes when I'm watching the show and my wife's there on the couch with me and we're engrossed in it and it's done, I sometimes wonder, it's got to feel really lonely being you. And I don't mean this in a cruel way, but I think, this guy's my friend, and I think, nobody's been in the position he's been in, and where you've got this epic story that you've created, that you've been working on for years and years and years, and now here it is, how it's supposed to be told, and someone else is telling it, and not only are they telling it, but they're telling it so the whole world sees it. And I'm just wondering, how does that affect your headspace, and how do you cope with that? I mean, I've always... it's like I can't just call you up and say, hey, how you doing? Because I can't relate to your situation, and who can? How do you deal with that?
Well, like you say, it's a unique situation. I don't think anyone has been in this situation before. No. Because normally when things are adapted to television or film, they're finished. Lord of the Rings was done by the time, for 30 years before Peter Jackson made the movies. You just have to, and I didn't expect it to happen. I've said that in many other interviews before. I had a huge head start at them. I did think they would catch up. But number one, I've been slower than I anticipated. And also, HBO and David Benioff and Dan Weiss made decisions along the way that made them catch up quicker. They eliminated a lot of the subplots and secondary characters, particularly from A Feast for Crows and A Dance for Dragons, that had they included them would have had another 2 years in there, during which I think I might have been able to finish another book. But I think you have to look at this, I often ask, when questions like this are put to me, the question, how many children did Scarlett O'Hara have?
I'm hearing 3 out there.
3 children in the novel, Margaret Mitchell's novel. 1 child in the great movie. No children, actually, because she didn't exist. She's a fictional character. So, character doesn't exist. You can say she had 1 child, you can say she had 3 children. It's the same story, but it's 2 different ways of telling the same story. And I was a comic book fan growing up. So I read Superman and Batman and, Archie and all these comics when I was a kid. But I also read Classics Illustrated. As that kid back in Bayonne, New Jersey in the projects, his exposure to many of the great works of English literature was through the pages of Classics Illustrated comic books. War of the Worlds, of course, Voyage to the Bottom of the Sea, The Time Machine, all great science fiction things. But I didn't stop there. I also read A Tale of Two Cities and House of Seven Gables and Moby Dick, you know? So you look at a book like Moby Dick. Moby Dick, of course, is one of the great novels. It's in the canon of English literature. But it's also a movie. It's also a comic book. And that was my first exposure to Moby Dick, the comic book, which I liked well enough so that, you know, many, many years later when I was no longer a kid in grammar school, but I was a college student, I read the novel Moby Dick, which is different from the comic book, but also kind of the same as the comic book. It's sort of the same story. And I already kind of knew the story, but I was experiencing the novel for the first time. And I think that's the philosophy you have to have with what's happening with Game of Thrones. I mean, there will be Game of Thrones, the television show, that will be out there, 8 seasons, you know, something like 80 hours of film with these incredible actors and writers and special effects people and stunt people. We've won so many Emmys and so many things. And there will be my set of books. And there are graphic novels, there's comic book versions too, and there's game versions. And you can, so it's a world, it's a story that you can experience in many different ways. And it's, you know, none of it really exists. So if you like the version where Scarlett O'Hara has 3 children, there is that version. And if you like the version where Scarlett only had the 1 child, there's that version.
But as you're sitting here shaping your version and continue to work out Winds of Winter, heading into that next book, Dream of Spring, do you sort of see the show as maybe almost being someone else working on a draft that you get to watch the ebbs and flows of what they do and maybe learn from what they're doing?
No,
and
not
feed
really.
It back into your version? You know, almost like watching, like, okay,
I mean, David,
Dave,
I've worked on this show. I've been a co-executive producer on this show since the beginning. So David and Dan and I have had many discussions, and, you know, many of the things that they're doing or they have done the last 2 years since they got ahead of me are things that I told them to do or told them that I was planning to do. So they're just getting to it first. Of course, in other aspects, they've verged off. They're doing things that I would never do.
Right.
One thing, they're killing a lot more people too. In order to wind it up in 8 seasons, they're clearing away a lot of the cast. So they're despite my reputation for being the bloodiest writer who ever drew breath, there are actually a lot of characters who are alive in the books but dead in the show. And some of them will die in the books, but maybe not in the same way that they've died in the show. And others who are died in the show will never die in the books. So if you guys want to see how many children Scarlett has, you'll just have to keep reading.
Let's talk prequels. So now we have these prequels, and we have, I think, 5 different potential projects, but Jane Goldman's scripting and show running, the one that seems to be most furthest along in development. What can you tell us about where we're at
well,
with those?
that we don't really have an official title yet. I'm calling it The Long Night because it's about the long night. You know, the Jane Goldman's concept is set. All of these shows are prequels. All 5 that HBO has been developing are prequels. So none of them are going to follow Game of Thrones. You're not going to be seeing the further adventures of Tyrion or Jon Snow or Arya or whoever.
I heard that.
And so these are all set at various points in the past. And Jane has gone back further in the past than anyone else, and it's the first show to be greenlit. So Jane has assembled a writer's room that's meeting in London even as we speak, and I'm not at liberty to tell you who's in that writing room besides Jane herself. But Jane Goldman herself is an amazing talent, and I'm very honored to be working with her. She did the script for 2 of the X-Men movies. She did both of the Kingsman scripts. If you've seen those, she's really, really talented and creative. British, of course. She's bringing a whole new sensibility there to it, and we'll probably be filming it in the UK. Right now, we just have a pilot order. It's not a series order, but they're breaking a whole series, and hopefully we will shoot the pilot, and HBO will like it, and they will greenlight it. But meanwhile, they're also developing 4 other series with different writers set during different periods, some of them based on material from Fire and Blood, very substantial chunks of material where they have like 500 pages of my history to work with. Others based upon a sentence that I was in World of Ice and Fire somewhere. Wow. So in that case, the writer is bringing a lot more to it. And how many of these will actually go to pilot? How many will go to series? Nobody knows, least of all me. It's still in the works right now. But I expect that there will be a Game of Thrones Westeros type project on the air for many years to come.
So if there's 5 different projects like that, do you sort of have like a wish list of like the different periods of the history you want to cover, or do the writers come to you with these pitches? Or
it's a little bit of both. Yeah. It's a little bit of both, and it may not even stop at 5. I mean, I've created at least 3 show concepts myself that I've shown HBO, none of which are currently in active development, but may be put in development at some point.
Huh.
So.
Yeah.
It's who knows?
Yeah, fair enough. So I'm going to jump tracks here. I want to talk wild cards. How many wild cards fans do we have out there? There you go. I mean, it's a nice round there, but that tells me there's a lot of people in here that probably don't know of that series. And I think it's one we ought to talk about a little bit at length here. So Wild Cards is a superhero universe that you created back in the 80s. And take us back there to when you were playing these role-playing games with the... Tell us who some of the writers were in those rooms when you were playing these role-playing games.
Well, I live in Santa Fe, New Mexico, and when I moved there in 1979, I met the local New Mexico mafia of science fiction and fantasy writers, some of whom were pretty well established, like Roger Zelazny, who was a dear friend and sort of a mentor to me, and some of them who were just starting their career. They were even younger and greener than myself. And one of the things they were doing was having a role-playing game, and I'd never done any role-playing. So I was invited to join them, and I did, and it was a tremendous amount of fun and addictive. Probably cost me a novel or 2. But at a certain point, knowing that I had been a comic fan growing up, Victor Milan, one of the writers in the group, gave me a game called Superworld, a superhero role-playing game, and said, George, you're a comic book fan. Why don't you run this for us? So I did, and it became completely addictive. For like 2 years, we played this game, starting one night a week, and then going to 2, and then 3 nights a week. Sometimes we were all writers, so none of us had real jobs. We would get together for dinner, and then start playing at 7. We'd continue to play till like 3 in the morning, and then after we finished the game for the night, from 3 in the morning till dawn, we would sort of rehash the game we just played and what fun it had been, and this had happened and that had happened. After a couple years of this, though, I said, we're spending a lot of creative energy, and we got some great characters here, and we're having a lot of fun, but we got to figure out a way to make some money off this, or we're all going to starve to death. So it was the 80s, and shared worlds were very big. So I said, we could do a shared world on this and, involve all these writers, everybody creating their own character. But you can't just take your role-playing game and write it up and hope it to be successful, because the things that make a great role-playing game and the things that make for good fiction are quite different. So the minute we decided to try to make a fiction out of this, we knew we had to reconceive it. And the first thing we had to do was come up with a common cause for these superpowers. Normal comic books, every character has his own origin, One character is hit by a lightning bolt, another character finds a magic ring, a third character is kidnapped by aliens and given an anal probe that gives him strange powers. Somebody else is bitten by a radioactive wombat. Okay, but I said that doesn't make any sense in a science fictional context. So let's come up with one thing. And Melinda Snodgrass said, how about a virus? An alien virus that reshapes human DNA. So we went that route. And we carried over some characters from the game, some of the most popular characters. but I also wanted to reach beyond the gamers, who included Melinda Snodgrass, Walter John Williams, Victor Milan, John Joseph Miller. And of course, Roger Zelazny was not a gamer, but we brought him into the thing because I knew he was an old comic book fan. My friend Howard Waldrop in Texas, some other Texas writers like Bud Simons. We got all of them involved. Lou Shiner.
Oh, yeah.
He was a very, very rising star in the 80s. And we came up with these wildcard books and started this. And the idea was, you know, we were science fiction and fantasy fans. Some of us were also comic fans. But as much as we love comic books, we also knew some of the problems from comic books from a science fictional point of view. And the origins were only one. And we said, we want to do a darker, grittier, more realistic and science fictional take on the whole idea of superpowers. Across the ocean in England, there was a writer named Alan Moore who was having similar thoughts. So he came up with Watchmen, which was his effort to do a darker and a grittier take on superpowers and superheroes. And Watchmen and Wildcards came out around the same time. In fact, both of them were nominated for Hugo at New Orleans Worldcon in 1988. Oh, wow. And Watchmen won. It's a brilliant work. What's interesting to me is that Watchmen and Wildcards, starting from the same premise, went in completely opposite directions. You know, we took the idea of superheroes that the comic books had been developing for years, and Alan Moore concentrated on the hero part of that. He largely threw out the whole concept of superpowers. The only, I don't know how many of you know Watchmen, but the only super character in Watchmen is Dr. Manhattan. He has superpowers. Nobody else has superpowers. The rest of them are just guys who dress up in funny costumes and go out in the street and punch bad guys with their fists. They're the Batman template rather than the Superman template. And so, because he was fascinated by the idea of vigilantism and heroism and, you know, who watches the Watchmen, etc. Myself and my wildcard writers, we largely threw out the hero part and we kept the super part. We were fascinated by the idea of superpowers. And, you know, if something happened, in our case an alien virus, to the Earth, and some people got superpowers, how would it change the world? How would it change their lives? What effect would it have, you know? What effect? I mean, think of it from yourself, realistically, because that's the way we wanted it. Imagine everybody in this room got a superpower, all differently, all random, you know. You could become invisible, and you could fly, and you were the strongest man in the world, and you could show lightning bolts from your fists there. What would you do? How would it change your life? That's what we wanted. How would it change society? What would you do? That's the most thing. And whenever I ask that question to a group of people and I ask them to realistically consider it, what would you do? You know what nobody answers? Nobody ever says, I would buy a spandex costume and fight crime. Yet that's what always happens in comic books, you know? Suddenly you can fly, so you will buy a spandex costume and fight crime. No, you won't. And the people in Wildcards, by and large, don't. A few of them have read too many comic books and they try to do that. It usually ends badly. But most of them go in other directions. So Wildcards and Watchmen have evolved very differently. It's interesting, they're like two sides of the same coin.
Wow.
However, Wildcards has been going for 30 years at this point, more than 30 years. First book came out in 1987. We just published volume 26. And we've had comic books, we've had games. It's been an amazing ride. We've now got up to 40 different writers have participated in Wildcards over the years.
How do you pick those writers, or how does that you know, that group has definitely evolved and grown. How does this club work?
Well, we started out with the gamers and with a few people that I knew loved comic books, and of course were good writers themselves.
Yeah.
Over the years, unfortunately, a few of them have died. Some of them have retired and stopped writing, or at least they've stopped writing for Wildcards to pursue other projects. So I've brought in new blood, and I bring in new blood new writers every few years anyway, just because new writers bring with them new characters, new concepts, new ways of looking at things, and it shakes up the universe. So you're not just doing, issue 347 of Batman. Mm-hmm. You're bringing in new guys, and it's exciting. It's a fun process. Yeah. But I'm very, very selective. I mean, don't come up to me and try to sign yourself up for Wildcard. It won't work. I want writers who are fairly well established, who will bring their own fans to, because we're always looking, of course, for new readers. So if a writer has a fan base of their own, has been successful, and they can come to Wildcards with some great new ideas. And even then, the first thing you have to do is create a character, and I reject a lot of characters because we already have a lot of characters. Yeah. The most exciting thing on the Wildcard front, though, is that we're now developing a Wildcard television series. Yay. So keep your eye for that. We have a deal. We're going to be shooting a couple pilots, and hopefully we'll have a series or two beyond that.
Awesome.
So
Melinda Snodgrass is
is part of that. Yeah. She'll be one of the writers and executive producers on the show, and we're talking to a lot of other very talented people about coming on and being part of it.
Beautiful. So another show that's much further in development is Night Flyers. It's not even development. It's coming. It's here.
Night Flyers will be on this fall. Yeah.
So we've got that. This is
you guys, if any of you are not members of Worldcon, you should sign up for Worldcon. We will have on Thursday, we'll have a Night Flyers presentation.
Oh, wow.
We will be showing Jeff Bueller, who is the showrunner and wrote the pilot script, is here.
Nice.
And he and I will be screening a trailer, a teaser trailer from Night Flyers and season 1, and he'll be there to talk about it, answer your questions. So that should be exciting. And the show will be debut on Sci-Fi sometime in the fall.
Yeah, I mean, this is a science fiction horror story that you wrote like back in 1980.
1980, yeah.
We're talking 23,000 words, gets expanded eventually into a 35,000 word version, novella. But it was created, from what I hear, based off of a challenge that was given to you. Or not a challenge that was given to you, a challenge that you took upon yourself to... who was the person that said that science fiction and horror were diametrically opposed and couldn't work successfully together within a story? Who was this person that says this? It was somebody that says...
I'm not actually sure at this point. I'd have to look it up. But okay. I was reading some criticism around 1979. Uh-huh. Yeah, some book about the history of science fiction or critical theory or something. And the critic put forward the theory that science fiction on one hand and horror on the other were diametrically opposed. That one of them was all intellectual and the other one was all emotional. One of them appealed to our thought processes and the other one appealed to our gut or our base instincts, and that they could never mix. And of course I took that as a challenge. And what the fuck do you mean? I'll mix them. We'll see. So I started writing what I call my hybrid stories, and I wrote several of them over a few years. Probably the best known was my story Sand Kings that appeared in Omni and won the Hugo and the Nebula. And then a year later I wrote Night Flyers, which was also nominated for Hugo and Nebula. Managed to lose both of them, but nonetheless was a finalist and got picked up and made into this movie in 1987, which no one saw. But the rights, I'd signed a deal that conveyed film and television rights, and they sort of laid fallow from 1987 for 30 years, and then someone discovered, oh, look, we own the rights to make a television show, so let's do that, and they have, and here they are. Of course, Night Flyers is, it's been reissued. You can buy copies at the convention, and there's a Night Flyers collection, Night Flyers and Other Stories, that has Night Flyers plus 6 of my other stories. And there's also a very handsome illustrated edition, which I know you'll always like the illustrated, which is only the novella, but some beautiful art in it.
Is this David Palumbo on this
yes.
one? Wow. Yeah, I do want to see that. That's cool.
So you can take your choice, read 2 versions of the same story. But the novella has a definite end. I mean, you know, there are a number of characters on a haunted spaceship, and almost all of them die. So I said, well, how are they going to make a TV series out of that? So they have. And you can ask Jeff if you come to thing. How do you do that? So, you know, sometimes Scarlett O'Hara has one child, and sometimes Scarlett O'Hara has three, and sometimes you kill all of Scarlett's children. And then you have to make a story out of that. So
you're executive producer on that one as well,
I am,
right?
yeah.
I mean, so you're executive producer on a number of these, on all of these projects that I've, since Game of Thrones for sure, well, probably since Beauty and the Beast, right? Were you executive producer on that one as well?
I was on Beauty and the Beast. Yeah. I only reached the rank of supervising producer.
All right. So I want to, you know, I mean, for someone like me who doesn't have experience in TV, I mean, talk to us about how much control and input do you have as an executive producer in general, but really, I also want to hear from you, since Game of Thrones, do you have more and more control or an input over these things, or do you even want that kind of input and control as you do more and more of these projects?
Well,
I'm have time for that.
Power mad, so of course I always want power and control. But as to how much I have, none.
Really?
None.
Yeah?
Hollywood is very loath to give up control. And even if you're like a showrunner, who's the person who has the most control,
yeah.
You don't have complete control because the network can fire you at any time, or the studio. And there are always people who will, can trump you right there. So it's power is the hardest thing to get in Hollywood, creative control. Even some very huge names don't get it. I mean, you look at big things like the Star Wars movies or the Star Trek movies, or some of the Marvel movies like Ant-Man, and you read about these giant directors who are suddenly being fired and replaced midstream by other directors because they ran afoul of something. What you do get as you rise in the ranks of Hollywood, you don't get more power and control, but you do get more money, which is good, you know. You say, your agent gets into tense negotiations, and you say, well, okay, you can have this story of mine to make into a movie, but I want script approval. And they'll say, script approval? No, how about another $1 million? No, I don't want the $1 million. Okay, could I have script approval? How about $2 million? and a piece of the gross, would that good? You know, no script approval though. So you never get the power, but
wow.
you get giant dump trucks full of money.
So even you. So even you don't get that kind of control at this point.
No, what you have at a certain point is influence.
Yeah.
Influence is not the same as power, but it's not, they will listen to you. They will take your calls. You can make your argument about, who should be cast in a particular role, or whether the story should end this way or that way. You can try to persuade them.
Right.
But remember that this is a collaborative process. There are other people in the process, other creative people. They're directors, they're actors who have views of how their character should go. Their directors can be very strong-minded, and they have a lot of power, particularly in features. In television, it's more the writer-producer, but still. It's a complex thing, and every project is different. Every project is a whole new ball game. So it's like you're a football player, a baseball player, and every season you're on a different team, and you don't know. You arrive on your new team, and you don't know, is the pitcher an asshole? What's the owner like? Who are the egos on the team? Who are the real team players? You don't know. You're in a new situation. You find out as you go along. So it's a challenging profession for all you young writers if you want to get into television and film. You're in the right state for it, but the wrong city. Get your ass down to L.A. and then you can start getting into that. But it's a high stress, high reward kind of profession.
Yeah. We started off talking about Worldcon. I think we're going to kind of wind this down, finishing on a note of fandom. Both of us being fans first. You have always been we talked about art earlier in the discussion, and you've always been a champion for it. and we've had a lot of conversations about artists, but I've never gotten to ask you, you know, you grew up loving comic books. Who were your favorite comic book artists and genre illustrators growing up? Who were some of those that you really loved?
Well, yeah, I was a comic fan before I was even a science fiction fan, although I started both pretty young. But I read comic books voraciously in grade school and all that. At a certain point, when I was like in 7th grade, I decided that I was too old and sophisticated for comic books now. So I gave all my comic books away, which I regret to this day.
Oh my God.
But it lasted only a year, and then I decided, oh, that comic book looks interesting, and I started buying them again. Fortunately, I started buying them right around the time that the Marvel comics kicked in, and so I was right there for the beginning of Marvel, and got all of the early Marvel things. First words of mine ever published were in Fantastic Four number 20, a letter to the letters page, Dear Stan and Jack. I don't know why Stan published it. It basically said, move over Shakespeare's Stan Lee has arrived. Why would he want to publish that? I don't know. But Jack Kirby, who was worked with Stan Lee on all of those titles, Fantastic Four, Avengers, et cetera, et cetera. Of course, the King of Comics, he was called. He was an amazing, amazing talent. And he was one of my favorites, and maybe even more than Kirby in my case. Steve Ditko, who recently died, the illustrator of Spider-Man and Doctor Strange, numerous other things. Yeah. Ditko was a unique and brilliant talent with a style that was kind of unmistakable. Over at DC, at the same time, The Flash was going. He was the first Silver Age hero. And he was illustrated by Carmen Infantino, who was a brilliant artist in his own way. But Infantino had, The Flash was running around Central City, which is the cleanest city you ever saw. They're immaculate. All the buildings seemed to be yellow and orange, and everything was in bright daylight, and it was, it was great. Infantino was a wonderful artist. But then you got into Ditko's Spider-Man, set in this weird place called New York City, which was much different from Central City. And it was all fucking weird angles and alleys with dumpsters overflowing with garbage and water towers on tops of buildings, and Spider-Man was hanging from fire escapes and all that. And it just looked so real and so lived in and so much like the place that I lived that, it took me there. And again, of course, with Doctor Strange, he took me to other dimensions, and he showed me this weird-ass psychedelic shit before there even was psychedelic. A great genius, Ditko, and he died just a couple months ago. A very sad end because, he had, I don't know what to call. Ditko had very strong philosophical, political views that were, I guess, objectivist, Ayn Randian, and they got stronger and stronger, and to the point that it made him impossible to work in the industry any longer. So he wound up just doing his own kind of fringe stuff, and, he died alone in some grungy apartment in New York City, and it was 3 days before anyone found him, and it's such a sad end for a brilliant man. I had the honor of meet Steve Ditko once. I mean, you talk about fandom. I am the first comic book fan, in a sense. Comic fandom as an independent thing grew up in the early 60s. And, there'd always been comic fans in science fiction. There'd been some fanzines devoted to comics even. But comic fandom sort of took off as its own thing in the early 60s. And in 1964, the first Comic-Con was held in New York City. It was one day only. Len Wein was part of the group running it. I met Len there. And it was held in some kind of union hall, the working man's Palace or something in Greenwich Village in New York City. So I took the bus in from Bayonne to attend this. And I was the first guy to sign up when they announced it and said, we're going to have a comic book convention, sign up, it costs you $1.50. I sent in my $1.50. So I was number one on the list. I had badge number one. So that makes me the first comic book fan. And we got there, and it was this tiny little room with, a few folding chairs and a table at the front, and they had 3 or 4 artists in, and fabulous Flo Steinberg, who was Stanley's secretary, was one of the guests, and Steve Ditko showed up. So I actually get to meet Steve Ditko, and, I said how much I love Doctor Strange and Spider-Man, and he said, yeah, Doctor Strange was his favorite too, and I got to shake his hand. I was just a little high school kid. And as far as I know, Steve Ditko never went to another convention in his life.
Him off.
So I guess we terrified him seeing us there. But I did get to meet him, and I got his autograph somewhere on something. I hope I still have it. And buried in one of my things. So it was amazing. I wish he'd continued with, he did, even besides Doctor Strange and Spider-Man, he did some incredible work on other things. He went to Charlton, where he invented the question and the second take on Charlton's Blue Beetle. He drew Captain Atom, all the characters that Alan Moore would rework for Watchmen. And then he went to D.C., where he invented Shade, the Changing Man, the Creeper. Yep. Incredible creative talent in mind.
They're giving me the rap son. I wanted to get into Illustrator, so I'm going to wrap it up with one last real quick hitter. For all the people that haven't been to a Worldcon, give them 3 things about this particular, or 3 events or 3 reasons why they should come to this one, for the people who haven't been to a Worldcon before.
It's the World Science Fiction Convention. They've been having them since 1939. There are many bigger conventions these days. You may have heard of San Diego Comic-Con, Gen Con, Dragon Con. But this is the original. It moves to a different city every year. It hasn't been in San Jose since, I believe, 2002. So who knows when it'll come back here next if you're local. This is your chance to be part of science fiction history. This is where the Hugo Awards are giving. You can attend the Hugo Awards ceremony, the Oscars of science fiction, the oldest and most prestigious award in the field. And I'm going to be there. John is going to be there presenting the Hugos.
I'm the MC for the Hugos.
Good God. We're only part of the act. I mean, this is a lot of clowns and a lot of monkeys, and at this circus here, there are going to be hundreds of authors, old authors, new authors, authors of all sorts. There's an amazing art show where you can go in and you can see all these wonderful paintings and drawings, and you can even purchase some of them. You can bid on them. There's an art auction. Sometimes, if you're sharp-eyed, you can find the next John Picacio, who is unknown and has these cheap works that you can then buy, and they'll be much valuable in a few more years when they become as famous as John. And there's, let's see, what else is there? There's the art show. There's panel discussions.
You know what it is? It's relationships. It's people. It's people who end up becoming your friends that you never saw these things coming. I'm bringing 50 Mexicanics, people of Mexican heritage and extraction, being that I'm Mexican American myself, to Worldcon, and we'll be having a reception this week for those people. Thanks. And I will say this, just to wrap this up, one of the things I hope to tell them, and maybe even a couple of y'all are in the audience right now, but what I've always found with Worldcon that I don't see with the other more media-centric cons is that, there's something magic about Worldcon where there's always some sort of opportunity that comes your way where you get to meet someone or be at an encounter that literally can change your life. And sometimes you don't even recognize it at that moment when it's happening. You don't realize until maybe sometimes years later that, wow, that happened and I didn't even know it. But these things always happen for you at a Worldcon, I've found. There's no show like it.
You could meet Steve Ditko. Or the new Steve Ditko. And maybe he'll never come to another convention, but he might be here now. Who knows?
It's an amazing experience, and it's where friendships are made. And I hope to see as many of you out there as possible. We're going to wrap it up because they gave me the rap sign a while ago. So thank you again. So this is the way this is going to work. We're going to call recess right now, and we're going to take about a 20-minute intermission. And I hear there's stacks of books signed by this guy over there at the Borderlands books tables. I'm going to go ahead and head over there too, because I brought a few prints of some of my Song of Ice and Fire work for you guys, some little 11 by 14s that I came up with, and I'm going to scribble on them for you if you want. Some of the proceeds from those are going to go to Locust Magazine. So we're going to take about 20 minutes break there, and then we're going to come back here in some sort of orderly fashion, I guess, and start doing some Q&A with you guys. You guys be all right with that? Yeah? So if that sounds good to you, let's call recess for about 20 minutes, and I'll see you over there at the Borderlands books tables, all right?
Try to think of questions that we haven't heard before.
All right.
The SF and SF podcast is sponsored by Tachyon Press, the American Bookbinders Museum, and Some FM, listener-supported commercial-free internet radio with over 35 channels of really interesting music to pick from. Check it out at somefm.com.
All right, kids, that was fun. Actually, over there signing all that stuff for you guys. Sorry that was such a blitz, but that was a lot of fun. He got to chill. So, oh, there you are. You're all lurking over here in the shadows. All right, so how am I going to do this? You want to make the calls? You want to make the calls, or should I make the calls?
Do we have a traveling microphone?
So we just have one on one side. Okay, so you're all lined up, so I guess
Great.
it takes the pressure off.
That makes it easy.
Start just, batter up. Let's go. Yeah.
Okay, thank you so much, George, for writing these books. And my question is, so Oberon had 4 children with Ilaria. He had Elia, Doria, Obella, and then Loreza. And my question was, is Loreza his mom's name, given that, he seems kind of like he was kind of recreating his family with the names of his children. So you have, Elia for his sister Elia, who died, and you have Doria for his older brother Doran, and you have Obella for his own name. So is Loreza his mom's name? And if that's not, what is her name?
I think you've given this a lot more thought than I ever did. I can tell you in a general sense about naming is hard. I have a library, even though I have no children. I have a small library of what to name your baby books that I have accumulated over the years, and I occasionally dip into those when I need a name. One thing that I did with Game of Thrones and Ice and Fire that violated all the rules of writing. I mean, when you're a young writer and you're going to writers' conference and all that, you have the old wise writers telling you rules. And one of the rules they tell you is never, when writing a book or a short story, never have 2 characters whose name begins with the last letter, with the same letter, because the reader will confuse, Alice and Amy. Don't have an Alice and an Amy in the same book, or the reader will get them confused. Evidently, some of these writers have very dim readers. And I followed that rule for many, many years during my career, but when I began Ice and Fire, I thought about it and said, I want to have more than 26 characters. So I'm kind of stuck there. And also, I noticed, I borrow a lot from history. I noticed reading history that in English history, everybody is named Henry and Edward. And if the English can have, 500 years of Henrys and manage to keep them straight, I can have all the Brandons I wanted. So I'm going to follow real life things, and I'll just depend on my readers being smart enough to keep up. But some of the names do have, I'm not going to say all of them, but some of them names actually do have meanings where I dip into the what to name your baby books, and I say, oh, look, this name means destined for a tragic end. Yeah, that would be a good name for my character. I'll put that in there. That's all I got to say about naming. Yes, next.
Hi, George. Matthew Tower. It's so nice to connect with you. And with the tragic passing of Roy Dotrice, there's obviously a huge vacuum for the Winds of Winter audiobook. So I wanted to ask, would you consider doing a dramatized full cast audiobook? If you've ever listened to the Philip Pullman, His Dark Materials audiobooks, they're absolutely phenomenal. The Story Circle in Britain is the company that did that, and I actually worked with them on my audiobook, so I wanted to recommend them if you'd consider a full cast dramatized.
I thought he was going to audition for it all of a sudden.
Well, I had some, interestingly enough, I had some meetings in New York when I was there a few weeks ago, talking about, some of these new forms of audiobooks, audiobooks that are more actually like radio plays or, where they have multiple voices playing it and they have special effects and things like that. And we have been looking at some of that. Probably not for Ice and Fire, though. I mean, at least I don't control that. Another factor, of course, that when you're dealing with television or film is if a studio wants to buy the rights to one of your books, you wind up selling them all the secondary and subsidiary rights too. So therefore, you're giving them up, and it's in the case of Ice and Fire, Game of Thrones, it's HBO who controls many of these rights and makes the decisions as to what to develop or not develop. Oddly enough, I was in a strange position when I sold that because the books had been very, very popular even before HBO came along. So I'd already had a number of what we call subsidiary rights deal or sub-rights deals. I had a miniature, line of miniatures coming out. I had busts, resin busts coming out. I had a guy who makes coins. And that almost killed the TV deal because HBO was saying, well, we get all subsidiary rights. I can't give you all subsidiary rights. I've already sold 7, I have 7 deals already under contract, some of them like 5 years old. And they didn't understand. They like, we always get all subsidiary rights. What do you mean you can't give it to? I can't give it to you, even if I wanted to give it to you. And, well, would you take another $1 million? No, I can't give it to you. I've already sold it. I've sold the coin right to this guy who makes coins in the basement from his house in Sheboygan. And he pays me in coins no matter how much money. I have a contract with him, so you can't. But we finally arrived at a deal. Yes.
Hi. Earlier you were talking about names and mentioned you had no children. I was just wondering, if you did have a child, what would you name him or her?
If I did have a child, what would I name him or her? Well, I don't know. Probably not Daenerys.
But why not?
It's too hard to spell. Oddly enough, people do name their children after my characters now, and then they send me the baby pictures in the email. So there is an entire generation of Daenerys's, Arya's, and the occasional Cersei coming up. I think there's going to be a lot of kindergarten teachers who are going to be cursing my name when these Daenerys's with the AE and the Y's all hit kindergarten at the same time. And I don't know what that little girl named Cersei is going to, what the mother is going to say when she says, Mommy, who's this Cersei that I'm named after? But there you go.
Okay, so you mentioned a while ago that some of your characters you created with some irony. So I was wondering, what was your inspiration behind the character of Davos Seaworth? Because he seems to have a lot of qualities of your typical hero. Like he's, strong, morally just, and righteous. But with a definite difference in the fact that he's sort of at the end of his life, but his adventure is sort of beginning.
Well, yeah, some people might say the same is true of me. I don't know where the particular inspiration came from. Davos, I needed a point of view into the Stannis camp in the War of the Five Kings. I needed a point of view there. I started out with his maester, of course, but then he dies in the prologue, so he couldn't be a long-carrying character, and Davos seemed an interesting way. I didn't want to make Stannis himself a viewpoint character. I wanted something external to that because Stannis is a very complex character and a gray character. I didn't want to give you his thought processes, just his words and actions.
Hi there. I love your histories. I'm really excited for the illustrated Fire and Blood coming out. So I had a history-based question. I was curious if Bloodraven took Dark Sister with him to the wall. Did Bloodraven take Dark Sister with him to the wall, his sword?
Did Bloodraven take Blood Sister with him?
Dark Sister.
Dark Sister. Yes, he did.
Yes. Awesome. Thank you so much.
Hey, thank you both so much. So a couple years ago, you, John, and George, you did a similar type of event in Baltimore, and then they wrote up some of the Q&A in the newspaper. And someone asked George you about fan fiction, and at that time you were quoted as saying, "If you would like to arrive in front of my house with a large dump truck full of money, I may consider allowing you to do some fan fiction." So my question, one, what kind of dump truck, like make a model? 2, what kind of money, like currency and denomination? And 3, what address?
Yeah, well, obviously a purple Tesla dump truck. Oh, Elon doesn't make one of those yet, damn. No, well, we want large denominations, of course.
All right.
But the address, I don't know. You'll have to, when you have the other two, write us about that. We'll let you know.
So, purple Tesla and large. Thank you.
Thank you.
Yeah, so this is pretty cool. Thanks for doing this. My question was, I lived in Belfast for a year, and I found it really inspirational, you know, sitting in the C.S. Lewis reading room in Queens. And I just wanted to kind of hear your take on being in Belfast with the filming and if it inspired you in any way.
Well, we love Belfast. I don't know if the new show will film there, but it's certainly a possibility. You know, Belfast, of course, is in Northern Ireland, and those of you who follow current events and history know the history of the Troubles in Northern Ireland. Game of Thrones, we haven't had any troubles since we've been shooting there. It was a concern of ours when we decided to move there, but we did it, and we've brought, I think we bring something like $40 million a year into the economy of Belfast and Northern Ireland, and we provide lots and lots of good jobs there for both Catholics and Protestants who work side by side on Game of Thrones and its productions, and I think maybe in some very little way it's helped the healing process there, because I think people really want good lives. They want good jobs. They want to be able to pay their bills and have a house and raise their kids in a safe and healthy environment and provide maybe the chance of a good career and a good life for their children. And if you give them that, then they're much less inclined to blow each other up and kneecap each other. And so maybe in some tiny little way we've helped, and I hope we can continue to do help in Northern Ireland. I will also say that the politicians get a lot of shit. Everybody hates politicians, you know, no matter what country you live in. But if you have good politicians who are really concerned with helping their country or their city or their state, they can make a big difference. And that is what happened to wind us up in Belfast. We were looking at locations all over the world. We were looking at Scotland. We were looking at Spain, of course, England. We weren't looking much at America because we don't have a lot of castles over here. But we were looking at these other places. And in Belfast, the leaders of the Protestant and the Catholic groups, Martin McGuinness and Peter Robinson, got together, and they put together a very attractive package for HBO. They came over together and lobbied HBO in LA about why Belfast would be a good site. And we got the paint hall where on the Harland and Wolff shipyards, where they used to paint ships like the Titanic. It's the largest soundstage in Europe. We get it for like $1 a year. And they also gave us $1 million of money. Our budget is very tight. So that was very controversial at the time. People were saying, Belfast is poor, people don't have jobs, people don't have this, they don't have everything, and you're taking $1 million of taxpaying money and you're giving it to this Hollywood fat cats kind of. It's the same thing that happens over and over again in America when there are tax credits. Well, yes, they did do that. They gave us $1 million. And what did we do? We bring in $40 million a year into their economy. That's what you call a smart investment. If I could invest every $1 million and get 40 times the return on an annual basis, I would take that investment. And that's smart politicians who did something really great for the people of their city and Northern Ireland in general.
Hello, let me first say that I was introduced to Song of Ice and Fire in 2001 on the recommendation of a friend. The entirety of the recommendation was, this is an author who doesn't pull his punches. The books have delivered on that, and then I was introduced to the Wild Cards universe by a different friend in 2003. I have a two-part question about your writing process, and they're related. First, when you're starting work on a concept in a speculative fiction, do you find yourself spending more time on world building, on the plot, or on the characters who live in that world and are experiencing your story? And for the second part of this question, I think you may have a somewhat unique experience on that. How does this balance shift as your perception of the potential of an idea moves from, oh, this is good for a short story, to, oh, this would make a meaty novel, to, this could be a long-running series, to, God forbid, this could be a multinational, multimedia juggernaut?
I'm terrible at knowing the second part of that question.
I knew that was
when
tough.
I began writing Game of Thrones, I didn't know what it was. Maybe this is a novella. I didn't think it was a short story. I knew that. And then as I got further and further writing it, I said, well, no, this has got to be a novel. I got a lot here. Maybe this is going to be a trilogy. And in fact, I sold it as a trilogy initially. My first contract with Bantam was for 3 books: Game of Thrones, Dance with Dragons, I'm forgetting my original 3 titles. But it was 3 books. And obviously, even before I finished the first one, it had become 4 books. And then it got even bigger from there. But I have, numerous stories that I began, and they became a novella when I thought they would be a short story. For me, it all begins with the characters and scenes, moments. The Game of Thrones began when I had this vision of the first Bran chapter where they find the dire wolf pups in the snow after they go to see a man executed. And that came to me, I don't know where it came. It came from out of the ether. Suddenly, I was writing an entirely different novel, and suddenly that scene was there. And as I wrote it, the characters came alive, and I found names for them, and there we were. And then I wrote that first chapter, and then I wrote a second chapter, and, one thing followed another. I follow the characters where they lead me. And that's one reason my books take so long, because my characters are treacherous sons of bitches, and sometimes they lead me down dead alleys, and they lead me into swamps when I say, I'm drowning here. You son of a bitch character, why did you lead me here? And then I have to go back and find a road or something like that makes more sense. And I rewrite, and I trash chapters, and I rethink things. I like to say there are 2 types of writers, the gardeners and the architects. And the architect plans everything ahead of time, and like an architect drafting a house, and before they even drive a nail, they know how many rooms the house is going to have, and what the roof is going to be made of, and how it's going to be heated, and how many bathrooms it has, etc. And only when everything is decided do they buy some wood and drive that first nail. The gardener just digs a hole and plants a seed and sees what comes up, and I'm a gardener, definitely.
Thank you. It's a privilege to get a peek inside your heads.
Yeah.
Thanks for all the inspiration, George. I really appreciate it. I'm one of those crazy parents that named their daughter the Hound. So, so appreciate that. One of my favorite parts of just experiencing the books was what I called the part, which was what I used to call the Red Wedding before it was the Red Wedding, because I'd have to tell people, read these books and then tell me when you get to the part. And then I would get that call. Do you have any really good story? What was your best reaction to that part of the novel? I can only imagine someone came in and beat you.
No one beat me. I did get, of course, you have to remember that the book came out like 10 years before the TV show. So I already knew reaction when we got to it on the TV show. And all these people videotaping their friends as they watched it and seeing the reaction was no surprise with me. I got the emails a decade earlier. And some of them said things like, oh, I was so mad I threw the book across the room and smashed it up and all that. And then a week later, I had to go out and buy another copy. I like that. That was good. Double my royalties. That was cool. Maybe the most amazing thing about the whole thing was the reaction to the TV show scene where people actually videotaped. They knew their friends and relatives and loved ones would be really upset, so they put a video camera on them and then shared their reactions on YouTube. I don't know if anything like that had ever happened before. I certainly didn't anticipate that.
Howdy. Shout out to the locust crowd out there. How? Thank you so much for the benefit. I like reading the credits. I loved reading the credits in the old 80s Twilight Zone. The first time I would have read your name. I loved reading Harlan Ellison's name there. And I really loved seeing Theodore Sturgeon's name up there. And I just wondered if you'd had an Ellison or particularly a Sturgeon story to tell us.
Well, Ted Sturgeon, of course, I loved his work. And I did meet him a few times, but not well enough to have any stories about him. I just to shake his hand and say, Mr. Sturgeon, I love your work. But God, he was an amazing writer. And those of you who are not familiar with the work of Ted Sturgeon, you should go to the Worldcon and pick up a book of his in the dealer's room and read some of it. Incredible writer. Harlan Ellison, I knew for many years. I met him first time at the 1972 Lunacon in New York City, where I remember I was a young writer. I'd published a few things, but nobody had put me on any panels yet. But I was sitting in the audience during the Young Writers panel, and Harlan was the moderator. And it had people on it like Jack Dan and George Alec Effinger and both Haldeman's, Joe and Jay, and Gardner Dozois. And some of you may not be old enough to remember this TV show, but Harlan decided he would do this panel with young writers in the format of the TV show Queen for a Day. You know, Queen for a Day was this horrible game show, or whatever you would call it, that was on in the 50s, where women would come on. The contestants were always women, and they would have to tell how poor they were and how miserable their lives were. And then the audience would vote on which one was most miserable, and they would put a fake crown on her head and give her a washing machine. And that was the format of the show. And the women weeping about their alcoholic husbands and their children were sick, and they'd recently been evicted from their home, and the audience would vote on that. So Harlan did the Young Writers panel in that format, and all of the writers had to tell how poor they were and the state of young writers. I always remember Gardner Dozois saying, "I'm so poor, I eat my cornflakes with water." And then George Alec Effinger next to him said, "You have cornflakes?" And then at the end of it, Harlan decided to raise some money for the young writers. He said, "Well, you've heard how poor these guys. Let's get them some money so they can eat during the convention. Let's see a sea of green. Let's see a sea of green." The thing that preachers do where you hold up a dollar bill. No one held up any fucking dollar bills. Complete failure. But then Gardner Dozois piped up and said, "Oh, all right, first one to hit Jack Dan in the nose with a quarter wins the prize." And suddenly the air was full of quarters flying at poor Jack. And they divided up that money. They had enough. Everybody got like $6.
That's awesome. All right, I'm going to say something right now. We got 17 minutes and 15 people in line, so I'm going to say, do not do the multi-stage question thing if you don't mind. Ask them quick, ask them punchy. Let's see how many we can get in.
Sure thing. No long question here. George, just wanted to know, when you were a young writer, when did you feel, or did you have a certain feeling when you were ready to start doing these larger worlds like Westeros and your other works as well? When were you ready to sort of build a world with a huge cast of characters and a world as big as Westeros?
Well, I mean, my early work, of course, never had that. I mean, my early work was, I did have a future history. Most of my stuff in the 70s was science fiction, and it all took place in what I called the Thousand Worlds, or the Man Realm, future history of distant planets and all that. But it was not a series by any means. It was, the stories took place spread over thousands of years and thousands of light years, just part of the general same template. I wrote short stories for 6 years before I even attempted a novel, and because novels were big and intimidating to me. But as I got more and more confident as a writer, my stories got longer and longer, and I started out with short stories, and pretty soon I was writing novelettes and novellas, and then finally in '77 I wrote my first novel. And then, you know, as you heard, I wrote a number of novels. I wrote The Armageddon Rag, my career crashed and burned. I wound up going to Hollywood. And in Hollywood, I discovered that although they liked my work, there was a common complaint. Every time I handed a script, it was, George, this is too big and too expensive. We can't do this. We love it, but it's great. But, you know, you got too many characters. You got these battle scenes are too big. You got too many settings. Can you cut it down? And, of course, I would do that. That's what they were paying me to do. I would do a second draft and a third draft and cut it down. But I always preferred the first drafts. Those were always the ones I liked. The later drafts were usually more polished, but the first draft was bigger and juicier and had more of creativity into it. After 10 years of that, when I returned to prose, I was reacting against that, and I said, I want to do something that's as big as my imagination. You know, these books are novels. I'm not limited to a budget. I'm not limited to what we can do, you know, in a 7-day shoot or a 30-day shoot. I can make them as big as I want. I can have incredible castles. I can have battles with thousands and thousands of people. I can have a very complex plot, and I can have a cast of characters that'll go into the dozens or even the hundreds. So I'm going to make this big. After all, I don't have to worry. These things will never be filmed. And that's how the gigantic cast of thousands Game of Thrones came about.
Hello, Mr. Martin. As a writer and a reader of both the Song of Ice and Fire trilogy and some of the Thousand Universe world, there's plenty of themes. There's mostly an anti-war theme. There's an anti-primogeniture theme. What would you like readers to take away from the words in the Song of Ice and Fire, and do you think that the show watchers will take away the same theme?
Give me the question, just in succinct form. I even missed that
one. Which theme of the words in A Song of Ice and Fire?
Yeah, I don't really think in those terms about, you know, this is going to be the theme of this book. I mean, books contain many aspects of life and love and the world and politics, and it's all grist for the mill, and you're all discussing it. And especially when you have multiple viewpoints, you have people looking at the world the same in different ways and having different viewpoints, and you give them each, hopefully you're as honest as you can to how that character would look at these issues, and they may not even agree with each other. There are certainly messages there, or I don't know, themes that you can ponder and think about, yes, but nothing that can be stated in a sentence. If I could state it in a sentence, I would state it in a sentence, and I wouldn't need to write these hundreds of very, very big, lengthy books with lots of words in them.
Hi, okay, I'm really excited to be here. Really excited to be here, love your work. So my question is, you said earlier that you kind of follow your characters where they go, and if they lead you down the wrong path, you kind of have to U-turn and come back. I was wondering, like, what are some of your favorite storylines that almost happened but didn't, and thinking back on it, you're like, oh, that would have been funny if I did that.
Favorite storylines that almost happened but did not?
Yeah, like you changed your mind during the writing process.
I don't know, that's hard to say. There is one chapter that I actually wrote. I've talked about this before. It's a Tyrion chapter from Dance with Dragons. And it's a great chapter. I really liked this chapter. It's very kind of spooky and atmospheric, and there's a lot of wonderful visual imagery in it, and there's an amazing character who appears for the first time in that chapter. And I loved that chapter. And then I realized that Tyrion had led me into a swamp. And that after this chapter, I didn't know what followed. Where do I go from here? I tried to save that chapter during Dance in numerous ways. I mean, at first I just wrote it as a chapter. And then I said, okay, maybe it'd be better if it was broken up and pieces of it were put in this chapter and then that chapter and then this other chapter. And no, it works better together, so I put it back together. Maybe the way to do it, it's a dream. It didn't actually happen to Tyrion, but Tyrion had this dream because it's really cool. And I finally just gave up and ripped it out and said, no, I can never. This is on its own terms. It's a terrific chapter, but it leads me into a morass that I can't get out of. So maybe someday when I finish the whole thing, or I'm long dead, my heirs will publish the Lost Tyrion chapter, but who the hell knows?
Thank you.
Hi there. My question is pretty simple. Did Bittersteel have children?
Oh, did Bittersteel have children?
Yeah.
No, I don't think so.
Okay.
Hey, Georgia. It's Kyle here from Azora Hype YouTube. My question is, you've paid homage to a lot of authors and different stories. How does it make you feel that in the future that your characters like Arya and Jon and other characters in your stories will be paid homage to? So how do you feel about that?
Yeah, I think that's cool. Yes, I do have a number of homages and tips of the hat to other authors that are in the books that you can find. Roger Zelazny, Jack Vance, Robert Jordan, other friends of mine. And will other writers be doing that to me in the future? Yeah, maybe. And that's kind of cool, especially if I like the writers and I like their books. It's been done occasionally before, oddly enough. When I wrote that book, The Armageddon Rag, of course, it's all about an imaginary rock band called the Nazgul, and which, of course, was itself a homage to Tolkien. But then, a few years after The Armageddon Rag came out, I was reading a Charles DeLint book, and there was a scene where this guy is going through the vinyl albums of his girlfriend, and he finds a Nazgul album, and I thought that was very cool. DeLint doing a tip of the hat to me, so I suspect I will like it when it happens. Yes.
Where did you get the idea to create parallels between your little folk tales in the story and the main events? Like Daenerys hears this story about the second moon wandering to the sun and cracking and giving birth to dragons, and then after being called Moon, the whole moon of my life for the whole book, she wanders into the fire of her sun and stars and births dragons. So where did you get this amazing idea to create these parallels between your own folklore and the action? Has anybody else done that? And just say anything about that at all. I'd be thrilled.
Well, I mean, any question that begins with where do you get the idea, the answer is I don't know. And thankfully, I get these ideas, and they tend to work more often than not. But I'm hardly someone. I can't take any credit for inventing that technique. I mean, many other writers have done this, where there's a foreshadowing, or there's a dream, or there's something like that, and then you see it come true in a sense. The art of that is trying to make it come true in a unexpected manner. So there's a prophecy, and then it comes true, but it doesn't come true in a literal sense or the way you thought it would. It comes true in something a little more clever than that, and that's kind of fun to do. It can be tricky to do at the same time, but it is enjoyable. I have thought sometimes, it's kind of one of the tropes of fiction. You know, I'm sometimes accused of deconstructing fantasy cliches and all that, and I plead guilty to some extent. I look at stuff that other writers have done and say, that's not true, it wouldn't work out that way, or, you know, or, gosh, I've seen this a million times before, what if I do this twist on it? But sometimes you can't take that too far. Like, I've often thought, have you noticed in fiction, whenever anybody has a dream in a movie, a television show, or a book, that dream has great psychological significance or prophetic value that will later be very important, so pay attention to the dreams. My actual dreams make no fucking sense whatsoever. They mean nothing, and, you know, I wake up and said, wait a minute, what was this? I dreamt I was naked in my third grade geometry class, and then Santa Claus came in, and he pulled George Washington out of his sack. What does that mean?
That makes me feel
better. Well, it means
better.
nothing. So I have occasionally thought, hey, I should write a book where the characters are all having completely nonsensical dreams that mean nothing, and the readers will go crazy trying to figure that out. But I haven't yielded to that temptation yet.
Yeah, that's not what you did, right?
We got 4 minutes, so keep them punchy.
Really quick. One, there's a missing Clegane sister. She hasn't shown up, and I'm wondering if that character is shown back up in the story at some point. And then quickly as well, the red comet that's going around the sun, you stick the science lot, so it seems like it's gone behind the sun, and are we going to see its return trip?
Well, I won't comment on future events, but I had fun with the red comet because that was one of the usual, you know, let's show a portentous sign that every character interprets differently in their own favor. So I thought nobody else had done that quite before, so I hadn't been doing it. Yes?
Hello. I have rather of a, hopefully a fun question for you. I have in my hands here, it's an internet meme. And I hope you're familiar with these, but it's a big picture of your face, and it says, I don't always kill characters, but when I do, they're your favorite. And I'm actually really hoping that you'll sign this for me later, but do you have, and John, this goes for you too, do you have a favorite internet meme of yourself that you just saw it and you just laughed? By the way, I have read the books, so.
I can't say I have a favorite meme, no. I'm really, really old. This internet thing is beyond me. I still type messages to the legs of ravens and send them off, hope that they get somewhere.
So I don't have a meme, I'm not at that level, but I would say that there's a cover I did for Frederick Pohl's Gateway, Random House, right around 2005. And this is before, we have social media. And somebody brought to my attention about a year ago that there's a set of new age, there's like a network of new age sites that have taken that image and have almost created like a little quasi-religion around this image and what it means to all these thousands of new age, I don't know what they are, metaphysical followers. And I check in on that periodically, and every once in a while I feel like typing something in and just, no, I'm not that mean. But yeah, there's...
You should do it.
But yeah, that's the closest I've come to that.
Oh, I'm wondering if Joseph Campbell had any influence on you as a writer, and if so...
No, John W. Campbell.
There's the answer. There's your answer. Next one.
Hi, George. So I was just curious because you have very complex characters. When you were developing Game of Thrones, were you inspired by people you met in day-to-day life, or were they more so inspirations from other stories and other books and even historical context?
Well, in a general sense, yes, but I didn't model any of them on people I know or to some extent they were modeled on people in history, but I changed them and mixed up this from column A and this from column B, and wouldn't it be interesting if I twisted this character that way? I like to play with cliches and tropes and try to make them fresh again. In a general sense, yes. I mean, I look at my own life and the people I've known during my life and the people I read about in the news and in biographies and histories, and all of it influences my view of how humanity works. And, you know, one thing I learned and observed decades ago is that people are complicated creatures, and there are no real heroes or villains such as many books do it. We're all a combination of it. We all have good in us. We all have evil in us. We're all capable of doing acts of great heroism and selflessness and nobility, and we're all capable of doing acts of incredible greed and selfishness and cruelty. And sometimes the same people are capable of both, and they do one on Tuesday and another one on Wednesday. And that's both the wonder and the glory and the terror of human beings. And I find actual human beings far more fascinating than the cardboard cutouts that you see in a lot of television, film, and fiction.
That's a pretty good way to end it, but I'm going to go ahead and let you finish it. That was pretty good. So, all right, we promised the house we're going to close it down. So it's going to be the last one. I got a final word after that. Go for it.
My question is actually very related to the previous question. Out of all the characters you've created, what character was the most difficult for you to conceive of in terms of psychology and personality, and why?
Well, each character has their own challenges. In terms of Game of Thrones and Song of Ice and Fire in particular, the character that's been hardest to write for me is Bran. And I think Bran has been hardest to write for two reasons. One of them is, of all the viewpoint characters, he is the youngest. So I have to constantly go back and saying, okay, I'm writing from a viewpoint of an 8-year-old. How would an 8-year-old, I know what's happening in this scene, but would an 8-year-old know what's happening in this scene? And would he understand it, or would he partially understand it? And how would he describe what's happening? What words would he use? So that is a far more artificial thing that requires me to slow down and think about every sentence that I'm putting there, which I don't have when I'm writing about Cersei or Tyrion or Jon Snow, someone who's more mature. The other factor that's difficult about Bran is of all the characters he's involved in Game of Thrones, he's the one who's most involved in what we can call magic, for lack of another word. And fantasy requires magic, but magic is difficult. If you mishandle magic, you can wreck your entire book. You can make it make no sense whatsoever. So you have to be very careful where magic is concerned. So for both of these reasons, although I love the character Bran, and he's obviously a very important character, he's tricky to write, and I have to be very careful with him.
Awesome. Sorry for the folks that didn't quite get in here, but we're going to go ahead and close it down. All right, final words. Thank you again for coming out. I made some promises to some people. So those of you that were trying to get prints signed by me, I said I was going to run back up through the Borderlands area, and I'm going to do that. If Rena's around,
let me
go for it.
Let me say, for those of you who want to hear more, Worldcon begins on Thursday, and you have Thursday, Friday, Saturday, Sunday, and Monday of panel discussions and signings. I will be doing signings. If you didn't get all your books signed here or whatever you wanted signed, I have 3 major signings at Worldcon. I have, I think, one on Friday and one on Sunday, and then I have a wildcard signing specifically for wildcards on Sunday. And I think a general signing. So there's lots of opportunity to get me to sign things. I'm doing a panel, a memorial panel on Gardner Dozois, my dear friend. I'm doing that. I'm doing a wildcard panel. John is doing a bunch of things.
Way
there.
too much.
Lots of stuff, and they're amazing lineup of other authors. There are hundreds of them, new authors, old authors, every kind of in-between author. So come to Worldcon, get your book signed, buy stuff in the dealer's room, buy stuff in the art show, And I'll see you there. I'll see you hanging around the parties.
Yeah.
I'll be in the bar. Don't come ask for an autograph in the bar, but I'd be glad to talk to you.
You know, when you go to the bigger media-centric cons, we're talking sometimes 20, 30, 40, 60. If you go to Alamo City Comic-Con, it's 100,000 people. You know, these are huge shows. At a WorldCon, we're talking, what's the largest attendance there's ever been at a WorldCon? Like 10,000 people?
10,000 in
Yeah,
London.
something like that. So just in terms of that math, you have a much better chance of being able to not just get autographs, but actually have conversations with some of your favorite creators. So they do have day rates at WorldCon. So if you haven't been, this is your town. This is your chance. So get out there. Again, I'll be back there signing those last few prints for those people I promised. And I think Rena had said we're going to be signing these banners. So if we have to get a paint pen or something from somebody in the back to sign these. And then I think she's going to be auctioning these things off. And I don't know how that works. Don't ask me. I wish I knew. Rena, are you in the house right now? Or is she around? No, she's not. All right, on that note of question and doubt, I guess we're going to have to wrap this thing up.
Thank you all for coming.
Yeah, thanks a lot for coming, everybody. Appreciate it. Thank you.
You can subscribe to the SF and SF podcast in iTunes. Just search for SF in SF. We're also on SoundCloud at soundcloud.com/SFINSF podcast, all one word, or on sumfm.com and click on the podcast link. This episode was produced by Maren McDonnell, edited and engineered by Rusty Hodge. Summa FM is listener-supported commercial-free internet radio. We have over 30 channels of unique programming, including electronic, ambient, indie, folk, Celtic, and more. Check it out at summafm.com. And please, if you like what we're doing, consider making a donation. Go to Summa FM and click on the support button. We rely entirely on your support. Thanks for listening.